The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Sir Oliver Sacks. The Man Who Fell Out of Bed. When I was a medical student many years ago, one of the nurses called me in considerable perplexity and gave me this singular story on the phone, that they had a new patient, a young man just admitted that morning. He had seemed very nice, very normal all day indeed, until a few minutes before when he awoke from a snooze. He then seemed excited and strange, not himself in the least. He had somehow contrived to fall out of bed, and was now sitting on the floor, carrying on and vociferating and refusing to go back to bed. Could I come, please, and sort out what was happening? When I arrived, I found the patient lying on the floor by his bed and staring at one leg. His expression contained anger, alarm, bewilderment, and amusement. Bewilderment, most of all, was the hint of consternation. I asked him if he would go back to bed, or if needed help, but he seemed upset by these suggestions and shook his head. I squatted down beside him and took the history on the floor. He had come in that morning for some tests, he said. He had no complaints, but the neurologist, feeling that he had a lazy left leg, that was the very word he had used, thought he should come in. He had felt fine all day and fallen asleep towards evening. When he woke up, he felt fine too, until he moved in the bed. Then he found out, as he put it, someone's leg in the bed. A severed human leg, a horrible thing. He was stunned, at first with amazement and disgust. He had never experienced, never imagined such an incredible thing. He felt gingerly. It seemed perfectly formed, but peculiar and cold. At this point, he had a brainwave. He now realized what had happened. It was all a joke, a rather monstrous and improper but very original joke. It was New Year's Eve and everyone was celebrating. Half the staff was drunk, quipped, and crackers were flying, a carnival scene. Obviously, one of the nurses was a macabre scene of humor, had stolen into the dissecting room and nabbed a leg, and then slipped it under his bedclothes as a joke while he was still fast asleep. He was much relieved at the explanation, but feeling that a joke was a joke while he was still, and that this one was a bit much, he threw the damn thing out of bed. And at this point, his controversial mettle deserted him, and he suddenly trembled and became a shin bale. When he threw it out of bed, he somehow came after it, and now it was attached to him. "Look at it!" he cried, with revulsion on his face. "Have you ever seen such a creepy, horrible thing? I thought a cadaver was just dead. But this is uncanny, and somehow it's ghastly. It seems stuck to me." He seized it with both hands with extraordinary violence and tried to tear it off his body, and failing, punched it in an access of rage. "Easy," I said. "Be calm. Take it easy. I wouldn't punch that leg like that." "And why not?" he asked, irritably, belligerently. "Because it's your leg," I answered. "Don't you know your own leg?" He gazed at me with a look of compounded stupefaction, incredulity, terror, and amusement, not unmixed with a jocular sort of suspension. "Oh, Doc," he said, "you're fooling me. You're in cahoot with that nurse. You shouldn't keep patients like this." "I'm not kidding," I said. "That's your own leg." He saw from my face that I was perfectly serious, and a look of utter terror came over him. "You say it's my leg, Doc? Wouldn't you say that a man should know his own leg?" "Absolutely," I answered. "He should know his own leg. I can't imagine him not knowing his own leg. Maybe you are the one who's been kidding all along." I I swear to God, cross my heart, I have not. A man should know his own leg, what's his and what's not. But this leg, the thing, another shudder of disaster, couldn't feel right. Doesn't feel right, doesn't feel real, and it doesn't look part of me. What does it look like? I asked in bewilderment, being by this time as bewildered as he was. What does it look like? He repeated my words slowly. I'll tell you what it looks like. It looks like nothing on earth. How can a thing like that belong to me? I don't know where a thing like that belongs. His voice trailed off. He looked terrified and shocked. Listen, I said. I don't think you're well. Please allow us to return you to bed. But I want to ask you one final question. If this, the thing, is not your left leg, he had called it a counterfeit at one point in our talk, and expressed his amazement that someone had gone to such lengths to manufacture a facsimile. Then, where is your own left leg? Once more he became pale, so pale that I thought he was going to faint. I don't know, he said. I have no idea. It disappeared. It's gone. It's nowhere to be found. Postscript. Since this account was published in A Leg to Stand On, 1984, I received a letter from eminent neurologist Dr. Michael Kramer, who wrote, I was asked to see a puzzling patient on the cardiology ward. He had atrial fibrillation and had thrown off a large embolus, giving him a left hemiplegia, and I was asked to see him because he constantly fell out of bed at night, for which the cardiologist could find no reason. When I asked him what happened at night, he said quite openly that when he woke up in the night, he always found that there was a dead, cold, hairy leg in bed with him, which he couldn't understand but couldn't tolerate, and he, therefore, with his good arm and leg, pushed it out of bed, and naturally, of course, the rest of him followed. He was such an excellent example of this complete loss of awareness of his hemiplegic limb. But, interestingly enough, I couldn't get him to tell me whether his own leg on that side was in bed with him, because he was so caught up with the unpleasant foreign leg that was there. Five. Hands. Madeline J. was admitted to St. Benedict's Hospital near New York City in 1980. Her 6th year, a congenitally blind woman with cerebral palsy, who had been looked after by her family at home throughout her life. Given this history and her pathetic condition with spasticity and ethetosis, involuntary movement of both hands, to which was added a failure of the eyes to develop, I expected to find her both retarded and regressed. She was neither. Quite the contrary, she spoke freely, indeed eloquently. Her speech, mercifully, was scarcely affected by spasticity, revealing herself to be a high-spirited woman of exceptional intelligence and literacy. You've read a tremendous amount, I said. You must be really at home with Braille. Braille. No, I'm not, she said. All my readings has been done for me by talking books or other people. I can't read Braille, not a single word. I can't do anything with my hands. They're completely useless. She held them up derisively. Useless, God-forsaken lumps of duff. They don't even feel part of me. I found this very startling. The hands are not usually affected by cerebral palsy, at least not essentially affected. They may be somewhat spastic or weak or deformed, but are generally of considerable use, unlike the legs, which may be completely paralyzed in the variant called Little's disease or cerebral dysplasia. Miss J's hands were mildly spastic and ascetotic, but her sensory capacities, as I now rapidly determined, were completely intact. She immediately and correctly identified light touch, pain, temperature, passive movement of the fingers. There was no impairment of elementary sensation as such, patent dramatic contrast, there was the profoundest impairment of perception. She couldn't recognize or identify anything whatever. I placed all sorts of objects in her hands, including one of my own hands, she could not identify and she didn't explore. There was no active interrogatory movement of her hands. They were indeed as inactive, as inert, as useless as lumps of duff. This is very strange, I said to myself. How can one make sense of all of this? There is no gross sensory deficit. Her hands would seem to have the potential of being perfectly good hands, and yet they are not. Can it be that they are functionless, useless, because she had never used them, had been protected, looked after, babied, since birth prevented her from the normal exploratory use of the hands which all infants learn in the first months of life? Had she been cared about? Had everything done for her in a manner that had prevented her from developing a normal pair of hands? And if this was the case, it seemed far-fetched, but was the only hypothesis I could think of. Could she now, in her 60s years, acquire what she should have acquired in the first weeks and months of life? Was there any precedent? Had anything like this ever been described or tried? I didn't know, but I immediately thought of a possible parallel. What was described by Leonov and Zaborozhich in their book Rehabilitation of Hand Function, 1960, the condition they were describing were different in origin. They described a similar alienation of the hands in some 200 soldiers. Following massive injury and surgery, the injured hands felt foreign, lifeless, useless, stuck on, despite elementary neurological and sensory intactness. They spoke of how the agnostic system allows gnosis, or perceptive use of hands, to take place could be dissociated in such cases as a consequence of injury, surgery, and the weeks or months long hiatus in the use of the hands that followed. In Madeline's case, although the phenomena was identical, uselessness, lifelessness, alienation, it was lifelong. She didn't need just to recover her hands, but to discover them, to acquire them, to achieve them for the first time, not just to regain a dissociated gnostic system, but to construct a gnostic system she had never had in the first place. Was this possible? The injured soldiers described by Leonov and Zaborozhich had normal hands before injury. All they had to do was to remember what had been forgotten or dissociated or inactivated through severe injury. Madeline, in contrast, had no repertoire of memory, for she had never used her hands, and she felt she had no hands or arms either. She had never fed herself, used the toilet by herself, or reached out to help herself, although, leaving it for others to help her, she had behaved for 60 years as if she were being without hands. This, then, was the challenge that faced us. A patient with perfect elementary sensation in the hands, but apparently no power to integrate these sensations to the level of perception that were related to the world and herself. No power to say, I perceive, I recognize, I will, I act. So far as her useless hands went, but somehow or other, as Leonov and Zaborozhich found with their parents, we had to get her to act and to use her hands actively, and we hoped in so doing to achieve integration. The integration is in the action, as Roy Campbell said. Madeline was agreeable to all this, indeed fascinated, but puzzled and not hopeful. How can I do anything with my hands, she asked, when they are just lumps of putty? In the beginning is the deed, Gauss writes. This may be so when we face moral or existential dilemmas, but not where movement and perception have their origin. Yet, here too there is always something sudden, a first step, or first word, as when Helen Keller said, "Water." A first movement, a first perception, a first impulse, total, out of the blue, were there nothing, or nothing with a sense before. In the beginning is the impulse, not a deed, not a reflex, but an impulse, which is both more obvious and more mysterious than either. We couldn't say to Madeline, "Do it," but we might hope for an impulse. We might hope for solicit, we might even provoke one. I thought of the infant as it reached for the breast, leave Madeline her food, as if by accident, slightly out of reach on occasion. I suggested to her nurses, "Don't starve her, don't tease her, don't show less than usual alacrity in feeding her." And one day it happened, what had never happened before. Impatient, hungry, instead of waiting passively and patiently, she reached out an arm, groped, found a bagel, and took it to her mouth. This was the first use of her hands, her first manual act in 60 years, and it marked her birth as a motor individual. Shrinkton term for the person who emerged through thought, through act. It also marked her first manual perception, and thus her birth as a complete perceptual individual. Her first perception, her first recognition, was of a bagel, or bagelhood, as Helen Keller's first recognition, first utterance, was of waterhood. After this first act, the first perception, progress was extremely rapid. As she had reached out to explore or touch a bagel, so now in her new hunger she reached out to explore or touch the whole world. Eating led the way, the feeling, the exploring of different foods, containers, implements, etc. Recognition had somehow to be achieved by a curiously roundabout sort of inference or guesswork, for having been both blind and handleless since birth, she was lacking in the simplest internal images. Where Helen Keller at least had tactile images, had she not been of exceptional intelligence and literacy, with an imagination felt and sustained, so to speak, by the images of others, images conveyed by language, by the world, she might have remained almost as helpless as a baby. A bagel was recognized as round bread, with a hole in it. A fork as an elongated flat object with several sharp tins. But then this preliminary analysis gave way to an immediate intuition, and objects were instantly recognized as themselves, as immediately familiar in character and physiognomy. Immediately familiar in character and physiognomy were immediately recognized as unique, as old friends, and this sort of recognition, not analytic, but synthetic and immediate, went with a vivid delight, and a sense that she was discovering a world full of enchantment, mystery, and beauty. The commonest objects delighted her and stimulated a desire to reproduce them. She asked for clay and started to make models. Her first model, her first sculpture, was a shoehorn, and even this was somehow imbued with a peculiar power and humor, with flowing, powerful, chunky curves reminiscent of an early Henry Moore. And then, and this was within a month of her first recognition, her attention, her appreciation moved from objects to people. There were limits, after all, to the interest and expressive possibilities of things. Even when transfigured by a sort of innocent, ingenious, and often comical genius, now she needed to explore the human face and figure, at rest and in motion. To be felt by Madeline was a remarkable experience. Her hands, only such a little while ago inert, duffy, now seemed charged with a pre-eternal animation and sensibility. One was not merely being recognized, being scrutinized in a way more intense and searching than any visual scrutiny. but being tasted and appreciated meditatively, imaginatively, and aesthetically. By a newborn artist, there were one felt not just the hands of a blind woman exploring, but of a blind artist, a meditative and creative mind just open to the full senses and spiritual reality of the world. These explorations too pressed for representation and reproduction of as an external reality. She started to model heads and figures, and within a year was locally famous as a blind sculptress of Saint Benedict's. Her sculpture tended to be half or three-quarters life-size, with simple but recognizable features, and with a remarkably expressive energy. For me, for her, for all of us, this was a deeply moving, an amazing, almost miraculous experience. Who would have dreamed that a basic powers of perception, normally acquired in the first months of life, but failing to be acquired at this time, could be acquired in one's 60s years? What wonderful possibilities of late learning and learning from the handicap this opened up. And who could have dreamed that this blind, balanced woman, hidden away, inactivated, overprotected all her life, there lay the germ of an astonishing artist's sensibility, unsuspected by her as by others, that would germinate and blossom into a rare and beautiful reality, after remaining dormant, delighted for 60 years. Postscript. The case of Madeline J., however, as I was to found, was by means unique. Within a year I had encountered another patient, Simon K., who also had cerebral palsy combined with profound impairment of vision. While Mr. K. had normal strength and sensation in his hands, he scarcely ever used them, and was extraordinarily inept of handling, exploring, and recognizing anything. Now we have been alerted by Madeline J., we wondered whether he too might not be half a familiar development agnosia, and as such be treatable in the same way. And indeed, we soon found that what had been achieved with Madeline could be achieved with Simon as well. Within a year he had become very handy in all ways, and particularly enjoyed simple carpentry, shaping plywood and wooden blocks, and assembling them into simple wooden toys. He had no impulse to sculpt, to make reproduction. He wasn't a natural artist like Madeline, but still, after half a century spent virtually without hands, he enjoyed their use in all sorts of ways. This is the more remarkable, perhaps, because he is mildly retarded, an amiable simpleton, in contrast to the passionate and highly gifted Madeline J. It might be said that she is extraordinarily a Helen Keller, a woman in a million, but nothing like this could possibly be said of simple Simon, and yet the essential achievement, the achievement of hands, proved wholly as possible for him as for her. It seems clear that intelligence as much plays no part in the matter, that the soul, an essential thing, is used. Such cases of development agnosia may be rare, but one commonly sees cases of acquired agnosia, which illustrate the same fundamental principle of use. Thus, I frequently see patients with severe glove and stock neuropathy, so called due to diabetes. If the neuropathy is sufficiently severe, patients go beyond feeling of numbness, the glove and stock feeling, to a feeling of complete nothingness or derealization. They may feel, as one patient puts it, like a basket case, with hands and feet completely missing. Sometimes they feel their hands and legs in the stumps, with lumps of duffy or plaster somehow stuck on. Typically, this feeling of derealization, if it occurs, is absolutely sudden, and the return of reality, if it occurs, is equally sudden. There is, as it were, critical, functional, and ontological threshold. It's crucially to get such patients to use their hands and feet, even if necessary, to trick them into so doing. With this, there is apt to occur a sudden realization, a sudden leap back into subjective reality and life, provided there is sufficient physiological potential. If the neuropathy is total, if the distal parts of the nerve are quite dead, no such realization is possible. For patients with severe but subtotal neuropathy, a medoceum fuse is literally vital, and makes all the difference between being a basket case and reasonably functional with excessive use. there may be fatigue of the limited nerve function and sudden derealization again. It should be added that these subjective feelings have precise objective correlates. One finds electrical silence locally in the muscle of the hands and feet, and on the sensory side, a complete absence of any evoked potentials at every level up to the sensory cortex. As soon as the hands and feet are realized with use, there is complete reversal of the psychological picture. A similar feeling of deadness and unrealness is described above in chapter 3, that is embodied lady.